as the United States would break from the London government, they decided that they weren't really thrilled with the London financial machine. Before we return to the 1910s, let's go back and explore how America got there. Prior to the Federal Reserve Network, the United States had experimented with many different banking regimes, going through a process of both creating, uncreating, recreating, changing, and all around being inconsistent with its monetary system. The American Revolution was very expensive. Many Americans may learn in school that the French became quite involved in the Revolution in an effort to push against the power of Britain. Yet the sheer scale of resources required meant that the colonists required wider-reaching support. The revolutionary colonies would go deep into debt, making use of French, Dutch, and German banks. In order to deal with the sheer scale of debt, the Continental Congress would print unbacked paper currency. Its backing? Nothing. And as the colonists were also in a gigantic war, this would quite predictably lead to hyperinflation. Nobody really wanted the Continental Fiat, except for some speculators, betting on the outcomes of the war. And so, at the start of the United States, the only true trusted money was foreign gold and silver specie. Recognizing the sheer disaster of the Continental Fiat, Treasurer Alexander Hamilton would push for the creation of a Bank of North America in 1871. This wasn't really meant to be a central bank, but some sort of softer national bank. In 1791, the first Bank of the United States would be created with a 20-year charter. The bank would act as the government's fiscal agent and stabilize the currency, and for a while this seemed to be working quite well. However, as the United States would once again come into contact with London, the War of 1812 would lead to severe inflation once again. In 1816, the United States Congress would charter the Second Bank of the United States, giving this one yet another 20-year charter. Under the Bank of the United States system, base money would be bimetallic, with both gold and silver reserves as backing. It would be tasked with handling taxes, and it would police state banks, presenting those banks with their own notes for payment in physical gold and silver, forcing the local banks to keep adequate reserves. Yet, because Merca loves freedom, and really didn't like anything that smelled Londony, in 1837, President Andrew Jackson would veto the recharter of the bank, seeing it as a corrupt monopoly. Thus, the United States would enter the free banking era. No federal oversight, no central nor national bank, no national currency, and basically what libertarians pitch to you as the obvious solution, one where the system is based on figure it out. There would of course be problems, but overall it would do fairly well. The country as a whole was able to be quite prosperous, yet it would mean some very tricky situations. There would be over 1,500 independent banks, all issuing whatever they wanted. Usually this would be their own banknotes, but they could issue anything, and it had to be backed by the strict standard of whatever they felt like. This would become wildly confusing, as one bank could issue a note backed by whatever, and you couldn't be sure which banks would accept it. If you were traveling over distance and presented a note to another bank, they might have no idea what it is. This would in turn lead to vigilantes, attempting to ensure that banks accepted their own notes and kept reserves of whatever they said they had, which could also sometimes be nothing. This was predictably very inconvenient, but fun. Imagine that you're a merchant in the 1850s. You go to a bank and deposit your fur pelts. They in turn issue you notes backed by their sheep. You take these notes into another county, and when you arrive at another bank, ask if they will accept these notes. This bank says yes, giving you new notes backed by whiskey. The banker tells you that these notes will be accepted most places in the state. That's convenient for you, and so you continue to travel. Ultimately, you arrive at another bank. This bank accepts the notes that you have, and you ask if you are able to get notes that will be accepted one state over. This bank tells you no, but says that there is a bank that will accept their notes, which in turn issues notes that will be accepted in another state. So you trade in your notes for this bank's note. This bank has notes backed by copper. You take these notes to yet another bank, trading them in to receive the notes that you need. Then in turn you take these notes into another state and exchange them for the banknotes that you need to conduct your trade. Simple solution. Unfortunately, this really is not conducive to any large government endeavors, and thus in the 1860s, with the outbreak of the Civil War, the Union would be faced with a dilemma as its expenditures racked up. Now, the finances of the Civil War are really quite nuanced, and are a topic that really never get taught, at least in any basic understanding of the war. Countries like Britain and France would back the Confederates, in turn giving them access to more resources. They would back the Confederacy because the imperial policy of these nations was that aforementioned system of cheap resources. They really liked the idea of a split-up United States, with one chunk being a land of cheap agrarian exports that they could manipulate and get at low prices. However, the Union would be supported by the Russians, because the Russians were also opposed to this imperial mechanism of Britain, and thus they had common opposition. Britain at the time had begun a policy of trying to dismantle Russia in order to gain control over what was considered the most vital territory on Earth, and so the Russians couldn't simply let Britain support the Confederates, creating a cheap commodity state, and thus threw in with the Union. Despite this support, the Union was facing bankruptcy. In response, President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of the Treasury Solomon Chase would halt gold convertibility. They would begin printing a national currency, a currency empowered under the Legal Tender Act of 1862. This would authorize the printing of greenbacks, a new national fiat currency backed by the Union's promise that it would win the war. Over the following years, the National Banking Acts would be passed. The Union would create a system of national banks with the ability to issue national currency, only if it was backed 110% with US government bonds held at the Treasury. This was now instantiating a debt-backed system, and thus the National Bank Greenback system was born, creating a permanent market for national debt, as in order to issue notes, banks would need to purchase government bonds. Following the war, the United States would resolve to return to a commodity money. The Resumption Act would be passed, bringing greenbacks to parity with gold. In the new system, national money would be backed by pure gold coins and gold certificates, over time bringing into effect the classical gold standard. Silver, on the other hand, would be demonetized. And this really opens another can of worms. Okay. So, in the late 19th century, there was this issue of bimetallism. You know how today, on surveys of what the top issues for people are, there's some guy out there who's putting Bitcoin as his top thing, and pretty much everyone else wonders, why is that guy putting Bitcoin as his number one issue considering the everything? Well, at this time, it was like that, but bigger. So, the fundamental question is whether the monetary system should be backed by gold, or backed by gold and silver. On one side, there were the bimetalists, demanding that the mint return to uninhibited and unlimited coinage of silver. They supported that this be done at a fixed ratio of 16:1, silver to gold. Alright, so why would anyone want this? Well, on the one hand, you had the agrarian populists and grangers. These were mostly southern cotton farmers and Midwest wheat farmers. At this point, in the latter 19th century, they had gotten deep into debt. Railroad freight rates were really high, and there was a multi-decade low in crop prices, caused in great part by the inelastic gold supply. They viewed bimetallism as a way to get a vital liquidity injection. They would argue that the minting of silver would lead to controlled inflation, bringing the real value of their debt down and increasing the cash that they would get from harvests. Another group in this camp were the Western silver miners. Things were getting dicey for the miners, as there had been a series of escalating strikes, some of them becoming really quite wild. Their motivations were pretty simple. They wanted the Treasury to act as a guaranteed above-market buyer for silver. At the same time, there were the Silver Democrats and various radicals. William Jennings Bryan would be the most notable of these figures. They had really turned the issue into a moral crusade against the urban industrial elite, leading to a fracture in the Democratic Party, with this camp trying to take over the apparatus. Something that would really embody this way of thinking was Bryan's 1896 convention speech. He would say, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And this was really a deeper social conflict between the working class farmers, the laborers, and the wealthy creditors. This class and social sphere conflict was really fundamental. A major driving narrative was that silver was the people's money, while gold was a weapon of Wall Street and London. And this really got to the anti-imperial psychology of Americans, and particularly the agrarian populists. They saw that silver would allow America to ensure its sovereign independence, yet gold would tie America to the whims of the London bankers. One major bit of narrative imagery here is that gold was the Jews' gold, and that gold was the genteel and gentile metal. And so you really had this archetypal conflict. Silver was American sovereignty. It was the little guy, the farmer, independence. It was the American way, the self-reliant frontiersman. Yet gold was the Wall Street banker. It was the empire back in the old world, and it was the Rothschilds. And there's something really interesting about silver in London's history, particularly in the era of the opium trade. Controlling silver via the derivatives markets had become a very important tool for the London banks. And so even if many didn't fully understand the complexities of this mechanism, there was an understanding that silver sort of broke London's model. And that's something that's continued to today. Just take a look at the price action of silver in 2025. That's really dangerous for a financial system that in large part has maintained control over the metal by shorting it in the derivatives market. So that's where you really get this clash between ways of viewing money, and why it became such a populist issue at the time. Yet on the other side of the argument, there were the monometalists. They believed that America, as a modern industrial nation, required a stable elite currency to participate in international trade. One of the groups in this camp was the Eastern financiers. They came at this from the mirror image of how the farmers were looking at it, because as the farmers wanted their nominal cash flow to go up and the real value of their debt to go down, the Eastern creditors most certainly did not want this, because that would mean that the return on their loans would go down in real terms. At the same time, there was the other camp within the Democratic Party. This camp would be led by Grover Cleveland. They largely believed in liberal laissez-faire capitalism with fiscal discipline. They looked at bimetallism as a dangerous populist experiment that would bankrupt the country. At the same time, in the Republican Party, there was the dominant camp of industrial modernizers, led by William McKinley. They represented urban factory workers, small business owners, and railroads. The fundamental crux of their position was that a stable currency protects domestic industry, preserves wages, and builds consumer confidence. They would make a sound money argument, arguing that gold has intrinsically sound and unshakable value, while silver is a depreciating asset. They would also point out that the proposed conversion ratio of 16:1 would be functionally legal counterfeit, as the global market value was more like 30:1. This would really tie into the Gresham's Law argument, arguing that if the US were to adopt unlimited silver coinage, then Gresham's Law would apply, and US investors would hoard gold, shipping it overseas. This would cause America's financial plumbing to be flooded with cheap silver. One mimetic argument would be that the purchasing power of a dollar would be cut in half overnight, destroying savings with hyperinflation. Many would argue that a gold standard aligned the United States with the other leading civilized empires, arguing that abandoning this would isolate the United States from foreign capital, greatly risking the industrial boom that was underway. And though this argument may seem bygone and alien to us now, it's really a very fundamental divide that's been with us the whole time. The question as to just how close to get with foreign capital. There's always been this camp of mostly more agrarian, rural populists, those who are very weary of foreign capital and the involvement of foreign banks with Wall Street. The risk that they're concerned with is just how much power over America is accrued to the banks in London and Europe. And this would turn out to be a very valid concern, because in the 20th century, the offshore banking apparatus would become the system. In large part, the place that we are at now in the 2020s is a relitigation over just how much influence we want international finance to have. Yet at the same time, there's always been this other side, arguing that there's more wealth creation when foreign capital is allowed to freely access the United States. And this is also true. The industrial boom of the Gilded Age in large part came from London and European financing. And so perhaps there isn't a right answer, but something that needs to be managed carefully, and something that may change depending on the circumstances at the time. For example, a fledgling United States really did require foreign money if they wanted to have that industrial boom in the way that the Europeans had. Yet if we look to right now, there's really no reason to allow international finance so many seats at our table. There just really isn't that much that London can offer to us. All they can really do is run toll booths, extract, and manipulate our government. So it's always been a balancing act. Ultimately, in the 19th century, America would decide to stick with gold. And as America went through its Gilded Age, this seemed to work. The country would boom, becoming an economic giant. The sheer innovation coming out of the United States was on a staggering scale, and in a century it had gone from a ragtag bunch of colonists to a true economic superpower. Yet, one major downside of this system is that currency in the United States was inelastic. A big part of the conflict between the rural populists and the urban financiers was that every autumn, Midwestern farmers would draw down massive amounts of physical cash from the New York banks. The amount of crops that needed to be moved each year was on a scale that it would put serious pressure on the banks. In turn, the banks would come to rely on London, drawing enormous lines of credit. This, in turn, would functionally make it such that the Bank of England was America's lender of last resort. Though the United States didn't have a central bank, functionally it had two central banks. One of them was the Bank of England. The other, J.P. Morgan. The guy. In 1893, a string of financial crises would emerge. There had been overbuilding of railroads that was threatening to collapse. Many banks in New York and London had made very large investments. At the same time, the London bank Barings had made very large loans to Argentina, loans which were failing, threatening one of the world's largest and most powerful banks. As credit failures sent shockwaves through London and New York, the United States Treasury risked a massive draw on their gold reserves, and there was a real threat of national government credit failure. At the time, J.P. Morgan was America's most powerful financier, and so, upon learning of the threat to the American Treasury, he would travel to Washington, seeking to meet with President Grover Cleveland. When he would arrive, he would be told, "Oh, you can't just come in and talk to the president. You need to make an appointment. There are procedures for this." And so he says, "No, I'm J.P. Morgan." He's told again, "No, you can't just barge in here and meet with the president." To which he says, "No, I'm J.P. Morgan. I'm meeting with the president. That's what's going to happen." And that is what happened. So he makes an offer to the president, saying that he can bail out the Treasury. He offers to underwrite government debt and to pay for treasuries with gold, thereby backstopping government credit and resupplying the Treasury's gold reserves. The president is very weary and doesn't like the idea of just one guy bailing out the entire country, but he really doesn't have any other options. And so he would bring together a syndicate of many of the most powerful financiers in America. Together they would bail out the Treasury, allowing the country to meet its $12 million draft on its gold, directly investing gold and bypassing Congress. This would be successful, and catastrophe would be averted. Yet now many in Washington were becoming very weary, concerned by just how much power Morgan had. He was no longer simply wealthy, nor simply powerful. He was vital infrastructure. John Pierpont Morgan had built an enormous financial machine, to great extent pioneering what is considered investment banking today. He would make enormous investments into America's industrial boom. His practice of buying companies, consolidating and reorganizing them, and then continuing them as new streamlined entities, would become known as Morganization. A great deal of his financial power was the connection which he maintained to Europe. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, had himself become quite prominent in the city of London. JP would make great use of this connection, as well buffered with business connections to Germany and the Netherlands. In the 1880s and 90s, railroad competition in the United States was becoming destructive, and the railroad wars threatened to drag down not only railroad businesses, but American industrialization itself, through aggressive buyouts, wrangling himself board seats, and in many instances direct threats. He would consolidate America's railroad industry, becoming not only among the most powerful bankers in the country, but the director of some of its most core utilities. The Morgan Trust, the financial nexus run by J.P. Morgan, would be a major financier of General Electric, Carnegie Steel, International Harvester, and so many of the core industrial entities that have created the modern United States. Though it certainly wasn't everything, if you can think of something core to American industry, there's a very good chance that it was financed by J.P. Morgan. And so, particularly upon bailing out the country as a whole, the sheer level of power consolidated within one man commanded not only respect, but fear, with one very notable description of his countenance as like a freight train barreling down on you. In 1907, a worse panic would hit. United Copper and many of the United States' key banks and trust companies were facing imminent collapse, and bank runs began. J.P. Morgan would realize that if these financial companies went down, the ripple effects could take out the entire system. So he invites the top bankers of New York to his home. They sit in his luxurious lounge, drinking and smoking cigars, and he pitches his idea to them, saying that he needs them to pool $25 million to bail out the Trust Company of America, explaining that while this firm is a competitor, if it goes down because of its systemic importance, it will take them down with it. The bankers don't really feel like it. So he says, alright, well, tell me if you change your mind. I'll just leave you guys to think about it. So he leaves the room and locks them inside. Eventually, the bankers realize that he has locked them inside his house and that they cannot leave the room. Oh man. Oh no. Oh no. The next morning, after JP has spent the night playing solitaire and the bankers have spent the night freaking out, they are on the verge of a stock market collapse. And there's really nothing they can do to save themselves, particularly as they are still locked in JP Morgan's house. So he brings them a document with the terms of the agreement that he wants them to assent to, places it on the table, and says, sign it. And then he leaves. They sign it. Though JP Morgan did save the country multiple times, many in government were becoming really uneasy with the idea that their entire financial system rested on one guy. Many of the New York financiers wanted to have something a lot more like a central bank. At the same time, many of America's wealthiest families had become increasingly intermarried with the European, and in particular London elite. And so there were many who really liked the idea of America having something a bit more Bank of England-y, something which might bring them closer into the imperial system. In November of 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich and many of America's top bankers would meet on Jekyll Island, Georgia. There they would discuss their ideas for a central bank, ultimately creating a blueprint and deciding that they wanted to make it happen. In December of 1913, President Woodrow Wilson would sign the Federal Reserve Act. This wouldn't create a central bank exactly, but more a network of regional central-ish banks, creating not a Federal Reserve Bank, but a Federal Reserve Network, one that was at the time designed to backstop the commercial paper market. And as World War I began, America's financial apparatus proved to be extremely powerful. Enormous loans would be written in New York for Britain and France, and at the same time, enormous quantities of gold would flood from Europe to the vaults of the Federal Reserve banks. The United States would not only become a major lender, but would come to possess the world's largest gold cache. And thus, as the First World War drew to a close, the United States had solidified into its new financial system, and New York had risen to become a peer of the City of London.